webinar. We have a whole bunch of other events coming up that we would like to tell you about. Now I have the great privilege to introduce our speaker, Dr. Ernest Morel. Ernest is a professor and member of the faculty in the English and Africana Studies departments and director of the Center for Literacy Education at the University of Notre Dame. He's also the director of the NCTE James Squire Office for Policy Research in English Language Arts. He's a past president of NCTE and the recipient of the Divergent Award for Excellence in 21st Century Literacies. His scholarly interests include critical pedagogy, English education, literacy studies, post-colonial studies, popular culture, and education across the African diaspora. He's authored over 90 articles and many, many books and research studies. One of those books is Critical Media Pedagogy, Teaching for Achievement in City Schools, which I think he's going to reference during his talk. He very generously offered to let us post his slides, and they are already on the Right Center website and will be dropped into the chat. We are so pleased to welcome him to begin this webinar titled Digital Literacies in the Culturally Responsive Classroom, Empowering Students Through Production and Critique. So take it away, Ernest. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Carol and Janelle, and to all the staff of the Right Center. And thank you all for being here today. I'm going to share my screen in a minute. I was looking at the chat. I see a lot of old friends and hopefully some new friends. So thank you all for being here. Before I keep going, I just want to make sure, Carol, Janelle, everyone can see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll get going. As Carol mentioned, the title is Digital Literacies in the Culturally Responsive Classroom. I kind of ran out of space, but I do like the empowering students through production and critique, because I think those are two different aspects that I'll touch upon today when I think about what digital literacies mean and why they're so important. But I was telling Carol before we came on how exciting and provocative the theme is for these 6 webinars during the summer about these first 100 days and what the post-pandemic classroom looks like. And it took me down a really productive rabbit hole thinking about what pandemic means and what it means to be post-pandemic. So I have here the post in quotes for a reason. You know, I think that the pandemics, plural, have been with us and may continue to be with us in some shape or form, but the post means there's a referendum on them and there's agency, there's an ability to speak back, to re-author, and in some ways, you know, to critique or repudiate the multiple pandemics. And you could go on and on. I just put 3 here and the list can go on. There's obviously the coronavirus, which took many hundreds of thousands of lives in the US and several million globally. Climate change, structural racism also had their own moments, and you can think about those as also equally tragic pandemics. So when we come back to the classroom, we haven't really had a chance to properly process all of these moments. So as I think about the post-pandemic classroom is not only as we come back logistically after the tragedy of the coronavirus, but how we process the repudiation against structural racism that occurred after the viewing of the George Floyd incident, and also this global movement that young people largely inspired to think about the climate changes happening around the planet and the cost to human capital and to environmental capital of that climate change. So a few things here to think about. I was in a meeting with Gloria Latton-Billings, who I'll talk about. I know many of you are familiar with her work, but someone talked about when we go back, and she just interrupted and said, very politely in Gloria's way, she said, we're not going back. And I think that that's a really important way to think about the post-pandemic. There's a lot that was back that we don't want to go to. And I think about, while this is clearly a tragic moment and there's a lot of collective loss that we're processing, there's also an opportunity to think about what it means to go forward. I don't know that in our lifetimes we'll have as blank a slate to reimagine what classroom life could be like, which is another reason I really appreciated the theme. It's a time to process. It's time to grieve, but it's also a time to reimagine. And I feel like all those things will be happening this summer. So in the bottom, I have this question, and I'll go back up the other bullet points kind of answer this question. In the midst of the pandemic, what did we learn that we want to keep? So I think there's been a lot of talk, and I won't go into about learning loss, but I also think that there's a lot that we've learned over the past 16, 18 months that will be important. We've learned, I think, to appreciate and to depend on family agency, just how strong families are, how willing they were to readjust their lives, to put the co-education of young people as a priority, just their resiliency and their power. The family unit, however, is defined is as strong as ever. An intolerance of social injustice. I feel that social injustice has been with us for quite a while, but the growing intolerance of it, the almost universal intolerance. Certainly, there are moments we see where those movements are being counteracted in state legislatures and in public discourse. But what you really have is a collective repudiation of social injustice in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime. The youth voice both in its response to the structural racism and to the devastation of the climate, but just in general, young people have used social media platforms. They've used demonstration. They've used civic engagement to show that this is a voice that they've had all along. I talk about cultivating youth voice. It's not that youth voice doesn't exist, but part of the role in education can be cultivating it. But I think we've seen it. We've also seen resilience from students, and I hear stories, of sharing one device across 2 or 3 people in a home. Students attending class in the bathroom because it's got the strongest connection to the neighbors. There's all sorts of ways that our students have shown us how resilient they are, how much they care about their education, how willing they are to make adjustments. And we've asked these young people to make tremendous adjustments to their lives. The creativity of teachers, the creativity of parents, the creativity of students, to really continue. I mean, we think about the logistical challenges we face, but we've continued to provide education, and it's required tremendous creativity on our parts to do that. And hopefully, we'll continue to tap into that creativity. Digital engagement, which I'll talk a lot more about, and hybridity. We've seen not just a fallback that we had to be digital, obviously, because we weren't allowed to be together, but I think we've learned a lot about the potential of digital engagement, how that's brought us in proximity to families and communities in maybe a way we weren't before. Teacher-family collaboration, I feel like it's never been stronger. This is be my 30th back to school as an educator. My parents taught for 50 years each, and I don't think I've seen teachers and families closer than they are now. And so hopefully that's not something that we lose in the classroom in the world. Getting students to think about the classroom as being broader than the 4 walls that we sit within in our time together. So that'll all be a big backdrop when I think about digital literacies in the post-pandemic classroom. Digital literacies.
If they hadn't had all the faculty and staff come, they could have already opened it up.
Right.
One of the ways I'll think about this work is in, how do we make connections? How do we hold on to the connections that have been made? And I'll be thinking about, finding joy, which I think will be a huge part of coming back. And I think, the education community is pretty solid on this. We've gotten some pressure from the outside to deal with learning loss and to assess where students are and to test them and to figure out what's going on. I think we're all on the same page. What we want to do is spark that joy of being back together, being in community, supporting students as they continue to process what has been a pretty upsetting moment in terms of upsetting what their norms are in their daily lives that they grew accustomed to. And so we really want to think about how the connections and the joy can be bolstered in the classroom that honors and promotes digital literacy and cultural responsiveness. Part of the joy for me is it occurs when students have confidence and their ability to do what we're asking, and they feel that they've been given power to share their voices and to produce. I think that joy is also part of identity. and perceived capability. We want connections to be meaningful connections, not just any kind of connections, but the connections that matter, the connections that honor students as being producers, as being agents, as coming from families where there is love and support and also that agency. So we think about how this pedagogy of digital literacies helps get us further along the way. So that's just a little bit of the backdrop. The next hour or so will be spent in really these bottom four areas, thinking about what culturally responsive instruction is, and why that's an important frame to think about digital literacies, what some of the principles are, what some of the practices may be, and also I'll conclude with just a brief conversation about student voice and participatory action research in polyvocal classrooms. So some of the problems and the promise, when we think about digital literacies, we need to think about both in terms of what's happening in education, but also digital literacies as being a space of problems and promise. It's not just a cure-all. But some of the challenges we face, I know that Goldie spoke, and I'm not sure that everyone here was on the webinar that she presented for the Right Center, but Goldie has been clear about saying the pandemic really just showed a lot of the problems that existed prior to the pandemic. And I know that she's a really powerful advocate for ending the systemic and academic inequity, but those were with us before 2020, and they remain. And so we need to think about those as some of the challenges we face. To me, the real challenge that I try to address in the work is more local than that, and that's a lack of student connection or engagement from either a low sense of confidence or a lack of perceived worth or a lack of interest, a lack of real connectedness to what's happening in the classroom or the curriculum. The underrepresentation in curriculum, is something that I'll talk about a little bit, but this last bullet point in red, there's a technological digital revolution that is enabling us to be able to convene today, even though it's still not completely safe for us to be in person. We're able to be together because of this revolution. And there's a generation of youth who are heavily influenced by this digital transformation, and they're engaged. And so part of our challenge, but also the opportunity, is how do we understand that engagement? How do we draw on that engagement? How do we help students to bring a critical lens to their own engagement and to the media themselves? All of that, I think, is a part of the work of what I think of digital literacies. So just real briefly, I'd like to touch on the research base for culturally responsive teaching, which is something that's been really important to me for years and years, going back to the early 1990s when I was a beginning teacher and to my years in graduate school, and really thinking about what a responsive education means. So there's really 5 bodies that I've tapped into a lot to develop what I think of as my kind of comprehensive approach. The first is the culturally responsive pedagogy and multicultural education. That work goes back really to the late 70s. I have some citations here from the 80s and 90s, but Jim Banks and his multicultural education and anti-racist education is really almost 40 years old. Gloria Lattin-Billings' work on culturally responsive pedagogy really just galvanized my life in the early 1990s when I was teaching in Oakland, where I'm from. There are others, with Sami Alim and Django Paris, really think about culturally sustaining education, which I feel is, it's in conversation with culturally responsive pedagogy, and then obviously Sonia Nieto, a 2018 citation, but the first version of her work on affirming diversity goes back to the late 1980s. Critical pedagogy is also really important for me, and Paulo Freire and others to really talk about the importance of voice and agency. And so my focus on student voice and problem posing education really comes from the critical pedagogy work. The sociocultural literacy research, is really, the Right Center is kind of an epicenter of Southern California, the Southwest, and thinking about funds of knowledge and how we think about learning is happening not just in the classroom, but outside of the classroom. How can we tap into outside of classroom learning to really make bridges and connections? The social and emotional learning, or what people call SEL, I think is getting increasing attention. To me, it's been really important because I think about social and emotional learning as primarily about building community, about affirming identity, about developing a skill set that allows us to understand one another and take others' perspectives. And then ultimately, social and emotional learning is also about voice and power. And then finally, new literacy studies thinks about culture is broader than maybe, race or ethnicity or some of the other ways we think about culture, language or geography, and really moves to thinking about media culture as being a culture that is really, a part of the everyday life of young people. And so the culturally responsive means digitally responsive. And so the talk really brings all of those together, the voice and the anti-racism and the cultural responsiveness with local knowledge and community building, but also a digital relevance to the work, right? So all those kind of inform these principles, that all students possess languages and literacies that matter to them. I think that we've learned that even more so as we've had these kind of snapshots into their lives outside of the classroom that this last year afforded us. Culturally responsive instruction is curriculum meta-pedagogy, so it's not just a what, it's a how. All students can become more engaged. There's no one that needs to be on the outside of culturally responsive instruction. It's something that I say a lot as I travel around the country. And we get a little bit of blowback that culturally responsive instruction means pushing some people out and pulling some people in, and that's not what it is at all. Culturally responsive curriculum honors student choice and student voice. And I think that that's important. It's not just about a representation of existing culture. It's about the production of culture, which is why I use that word in the subtitle. So I want to go on, but I saw there were a couple of questions, Janelle, if you wanted to throw out a question, or I could keep going.
Sure, we can address one question that came up. You had discussed how the pandemic allowed us to use digital channels to communicate in new and exciting ways. So I was wondering if you had any concrete suggestions for school leaders who are interested in leveraging what they learned through the pandemic for continuing that important, meaningful connection between classrooms and families. So what suggestions do you have for school leaders in maintaining those connections that were built throughout the pandemic?
So there are a lot, and I'll go through a lot throughout the talk, but I think just a couple right now. The digital connection to parents and families across the age range. I know that we're talking secondary here, but we've never had that kind of connection with all parents. So to continue to use the digital platforms that we have available to us to be able to communicate with parents. I think also, students acquired a media literacy. I think that it's still happening, but we can tap into that. It wasn't just about learning Zoom. It was really about learning more about their devices and connectivity. It was learning how to be prudent researchers on the internet, to gather information, how to create presentations. I saw kids as young as 8, 9 years old. They're creating presentations with Google slide decks and sharing them. And so we want to tap into that digital literacy as well. But I think the most important for me is we see how much students are connected to the digital world, how connected they are, even outside of what school life means. And we want to continue to tap into that. We want to problematize it at moments and have students really think critically about the messages that are sent to them via the media. And we want to think about how we further students' knowledge and capability across the media platforms. But I'll have a lot more specific suggestions, but I think that we don't want to back off of all of that. And the last thing I'll say is, for the last 20 years or so, I started teaching in 1993, but I can say at least by the late 90s, we were already involved in a hybridity in instruction. We had emails and we'd send emails to families, and, we had, students who would use the internet, and we had, students who would make digital films in class and that sort of thing. So hybridity has been with us. I think it was pushed forward in a lot of ways over the last 16 months, but the hybridity is not new. But I think we need to ask the question of how do we leverage the benefits of a hybrid learning environment while also recapturing the benefits of being in person and community.
Thank you.
So here on this slide, I'm going to be talking about a lot of the areas in red, but I just wanted to have this as a placeholder for you. You know, I tried to keep it to 10, but 12 is also a good number. I'm into numbers. So 12, I think, is a number of completion or perfection for some. So these are just research-driven, culturally responsive literacy practices. And a lot of them connect to, I think, the goals that Carol mentioned for the Wright Center. We'll be really focused on polyfocal classrooms and popular culture and writing across genres and digital media literacies and participatory action research, as well as family community engagement. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in, and then also feel free, Janelle or Carol, to jump in with any questions that you see in the chat. Unfortunately, it's hard for me to keep going in and look at the chat at the same time, but I can see when the questions come up.
Ernest, we might pause a second time to focus on hybridity. It seems like in the chat we had some additional comments around hybridity. We understand that when all the resources are in play and folks are highly versed in this type of teaching, that it can be incredibly powerful and level the playing field in terms of equity. What might schools need to do differently moving forward if this model is to be successful across the board?
Okay, yep, so that's a great question. I'll answer it in brief now, and then I think maybe in 4 or 5 slides, I'll have a couple of slides that will be specific. One of the things I think that we need to do is think about the budgets for schools and making sure that there's an equity and access to the tools in the classroom and connectivity. Yes. Whether that's grant writing, whether it's thinking about, you know, how funds are allocated, that these aren't extra tools anymore, that they're essential. So the hybridity exists even in the classroom, you know, where you might have students on handheld devices or desktops or laptops, and they're, you know, communicating with each other. They're communicating with people who are not in the classroom. So we want to make sure we have the tools. I think one of the things that really became clear in South Bend, where I am, you know, it's a very diverse district, probably the most diverse district I've seen, including my days in California and New York. If we want there to be connectivity at home, we have to subsidize that connectivity. And whether it's students taking devices home, it's providing, you know, ways for parents to and families to have access. If they don't, it's we had mobile buses walking around or driving around as connection stations. So I think we want to think about that in terms of sponsoring the hybridity. I think we also want to think about what are responsive technological practices, not just technological practices, right? How do we use technology not to remediate, but to expand on student voice? And so a lot of internet use is policed. You know, there's, you know, it's hard to get beyond firewalls in school, and I understand why the firewalls exist, but sometimes they just make it more difficult for students to do the kind of work we want them to be able to do. So there's a lot of considerations around connectivity. There are, I think, considerations around just the development of the know-how, making sure that there's kind of an equitable development instead of assuming that kids come in as digital natives and experts. What do we need to teach them? How can that be part of the curriculum? And then finally, I think the hybridity really allows for a sharing of expertise. And how do we create projects that unleash young people's connection to their digital genius? As well as, you know, just, you know, thinking about us providing all the opportunity. The hybrid environment, I think there's a lot of shared spaces for expertise and input.
Thanks for that.
Okay, so I'll go on, but if something comes up, it's fine. I'm happy to have you jump in. It's actually fun to have a little bit of back and forth. So some of the need for digital media literacy, as Carol mentioned, I wrote a book several years ago. This is something I've been interested in for, you know, at least 20 years. So the pandemic has, I think, brought that forward a little bit, but this is something I've really been interested in for a long time. And a lot of it goes back to some of the potential harms of media. So we think about digital media and digital literacies, not just as something that is, you know, only positive, but the young people's engagement with the digital world is incredibly fraught, particularly because of corporate media. And that's how I really got in before all the productive capabilities became productive capabilities. We knew that young people were consuming media. And so the global health community in the United States, that's the American Medical Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, had done a lot of research even in the early 90s, talking about some of the negative health outcomes associated with overexposure and uncritical consumption, sleep problems, depression, anxiety, eating disorders. You know, and they called on us as educators and families to address media use. And so that's really where I began this work, you know, almost 30 years ago. And at the same time, you know, right around the turn of the millennium, we really began to understand this notion of digital divides. And so this is a book that Jen Rosell and I edited just last year. We talked about digital divides at 3 levels. One, I think, Janelle, you and I just talked about equitable access to hardware and software, how technology is used in the classroom, for what purposes, but this final one, whether student users know how to use information and communication technologies for personal empowerment. You know, is also influenced by the work of Henry Jenkins and participatory culture. It says, you know, we want to applaud young people for their digital ingenuity and their digital experience, but we don't want to fetishize it. They're also young people who continue to need to be taught and guided. And so part of a digital divide is where are young people being allowed access and where are they being taught, you know, around the use of the media. So the potential of kind of overcoming those digital divides in a world that's becoming increasingly technologically connected, at the same time being wary of a lot of the potential negativity that comes with uncritical consumption. Both of those are important, right? So there's the push and the pull, or there's the pull is kind of, you know, how we're going to be these digital citizens in the 21st century, and the push is like pushing back on the corporate invasion of our young people's lives through tablets and phones and other ways that they communicate, video games and music and film, etc. So there's a real promise, you know, when you think about digital media education. It's engaging. Many times young people perceive the media as relevant and fun. We can help our students to be more reflective about their engagement, and I have some really specific activities around this I'm about to get to. We can develop critical thinking and questioning that can be used for any text. So for me, in the classroom in the early 90s when I first started, I would bring in hip hop and popular culture, and you know, the young people were able to engage that in a way because of their familiarity that allowed them to have pretty sophisticated critiques. And we would bring those same critiques to news media content or novels or plays or the other things that, you know, we were looking at in the classroom. You can make thematic connections as well. And then finally, you know, these are really powerful communication tools for young people, and we've seen that. And so this is just another way that young people can express their voice. So I have 4 dimensions. I've been alluding to them. I'll just name them, but I'll go through them individually. Consumption, we talk about what it means to consume media production, dissemination, and invention, right? Those are the 4 dimensions that I'll talk about. So the first one, I think, is probably the most familiar. And for each one, I tried to have a question. How do we read, watch, listen, or play more critically? And so this is everything from Netflix and iTunes to the video games students play to social media. And in all those ways, they're consuming just, you know, tens of thousands of words a day, really. And those words come with messages, right? They don't come value neutral. And so we want students to understand, what does it mean to play this game or listen to this song or to watch this content? And how can you do it in a critical way? So we're not trying to take content away, but give you a set of questions and a framework with which you can feel very confident about engaging this media critically as a consumer. The second domain is production, where I feel like we've grown a lot. You know, all the work that we've done, you know, the Right Center, the work I do at my center, and the work that I've done as a classroom teacher has moved a lot, you know, since many of us were students, where, you know, there wasn't the possibility to produce digitally. You had to be really wealthy, or you had to be, you know, in a corporate setting to have access to these kinds of tools. Now they're just literally at your fingertips. So the question is, how do we help students to use media technology to communicate with others? Everything from programming, to participating in social media, to digital filmmaking, to podcast, and Google Suites, blogs, you name it. There's all sorts of ways that students are producing these days. And so the question is about the skill set that you need, both understanding the technologies and their affordances and limitations, but also the skill set that helps to navigate and utilize those technologies. All of that is, I think, part of what a media education, what a digital literacy education means today, is helping students to gain a skill set to be able to use media more provocatively, not just to consume them. The area that I'm most interested in now, because I think it's new, is curation and distribution or dissemination. They're all kind of versions of the same, and a lot of this came from research that I know Nicole Mira is coming to do a webinar later this summer. And the more we looked at how young people were using the media, the more we realized it wasn't necessarily production or consumption, it's just curation. That's taking a comment that you've seen in the social media and sharing it or liking it or retweeting it, or all the different ways that we sanction content, or taking something from like the internet and putting in a link on your social media, right? You're curating information. You're saying, I think this story is important, or this song, or this movie clip, or this video that I saw, or this news content. And so not just young people are really spending a lot of their times increasingly curating content, sanctioning it, or as we saw, in 2020 and 2021, repudiating content or speaking back against it. So this notion of engaging content that's already out there and curating it, either kind of elevating it or providing commentary or critique, are newer ways that we're involved in the media, and they also require a skill set. You see the second point in red here, learning how to analyze audience and tailor content for different audiences is also part of distribution. How you share it, how you represent it, right, is how I think about it as well. Finally, this may be even more on the horizon. How can we provide all children with the opportunities to design and build the technologies of the future? I feel like this is still a divide. I was at a school, a wealthy boarding school, and I was talking about creating mobile applications, and a couple of students came up to me afterwards and they're like, Mr. Morrell, we can do that. We can build it. And I was super excited, but I was also a little bit chagrined at like how few students I felt across the country actually knew how to create a mobile application. There's, 99% of them know how to use cell phones and social media, but fewer of them see themselves as inventors. And so I think of the Yes We Code and getting more women, more people of color to see themselves as digital inventors is one of the civil rights issues of our time, right? So it's something that we have to think more about. And I'll just kind of point to this article on the right that's underneath the photo is where a lot of this comes from. And you can see Nicole was co-author on that. We talk about these 4 dimensions of media production, consumption, distribution, and invention. So now I'll go ahead and jump into the practices, unless there's a question, Carol or Janelle, or a comment you'd like to make.
Not at this point.
Okay, great. So then this is the heart of it. I'm just going to run through a number of practices that kind of stem from this foundation that we just set. The first one is how do we consume? So one of the things we do with students is give a set of questions, like a framework. This is from the Critical Media Pedagogy book that Carol mentioned earlier that you can see on the right. There are 2 ways I think about this. The big questions: what ideas or values are promoted with the older kids, like the secondary students we're talking about. I use the term value proposition. What's the value proposition in the media? Understanding that you can't say neutral or none, right? That it all comes from some particular value system. There's some value. The second is audience construction. How are you constructed as an audience? What are you led to do or believe? And so we use terms like ideology, bias, right? What are the biases in the media ideology, the media discourse? Those are all terms I think we should feel comfortable with using with young people as we kind of give them a framework like this to think about analyzing the media, whether we're talking about a video game or social media or a film or a song, a website, blog, you name it. We start here, with how are media being used to shape social thought? And I like to use older media. We go back to the Mad Men generation in the 1950s and think about post-World War II, when we got bombarded. World War II is really, a place where nations understood the power of media as a propaganda force. And so a lot of the media studies goes back to the 30s and 40s and this media warfare between the Third Reich and the United States, and how we began to use film and advertisements. And so that really propelled in post-war, when we could turn our attention more domestically and corporately, using those same kind of techniques to get people to buy stuff. So this is an ad for beer, but it's really an ad for a kind of social structure that's overtly patriarchal and middle class, and it kind of norms an Anglo-centric perspective here on how people interact in the kitchen. But it's about selling beer, but it's really about selling culture. So we get students to think about this, and they can see all the things that are wrong with this particular ad for Schlitz. Yeah, it's a beer. But it's harder sometimes to see it in our own world, right? So it's easier for me to get started looking at ads for the 60s, and it's like a clay pigeon for them, as opposed to starting too close to home and thinking about messages about race, like in this, in Aunt Jemima. And, this is an ad that made it into my childhood in the 70s and 80s, right? Aunt Jemima looks a little bit different these days, but this is a mammy kind of an image, right? And so she's making pancakes in there, but the pancakes aren't for her, right? When it's Aunt Jemima. What are we saying about kind of the intersectionality of race and class and gender in ads like Aunt Jemima pancakes, why do we need Aunt Jemima pancakes? What is that reminiscent of for the people who were the audience and who were buying the pancakes? So we talk about that, right? That there's a value system, around these two ads that I just showed that are implicit, right? But they still matter. And so sometimes what we do in media education is make the implicit explicit. We vocalize it so that we can talk about it and critique it, and maybe step away from it and say, it's not exactly how we want to exist in the world, but media can push us in these directions if we're not careful, if we're not vigilant in our readings of media. This is a more contemporary one on the left. The one on the right is more from that generation. And so you can see, some of the trends here, right, around gender norms or racial norms. And it's just, we are besieged with these images. Children engage these images by the millions in their formative years, right? It's part of what we do in the classroom is say, let's take a look at them, right? I'm not trying to convince you to never, to look at media, to keep your head in the sand, as Doug Kellner would say. But we are trying to get you to bring a little bit of a critical eye and a historical sense of these media images that you're looking at by the thousands every day. Here's an activity to the question you asked earlier, Janelle, that I do a lot. So analyzing contemporary ads, you can use a digital device, find an advertisement that contains some kind of bias. So there's that word. What are the biases that are evident in the advertisement? And how might the ads be improved to eliminate bias? So this is an easy one. You can also bring in print media. Back in the old days of the 1990s and early 2000s, I bring in newspapers and magazines and just spread them out around the classroom. I still think that that's an effective way to do it. Sometimes, the students have devices or they're able to access a device in the classroom, but I ask them to look at ads that they would encounter in their everyday life. It's not, in the verbs here of the bullet points, but go find an ad that you would encounter and look for some of the biases in it, not just an ad that's out there in the world. But this is a great activity. It's a 3-part activity, and so I'll show you what some of the other parts of this activity are. They can be done by themselves, but I think about them as kind of being connected to one another. Here's a second part of an activity, and that's finding examples of good ads, or ads that you think share some kind of a positive message. I think both of these ads. So we're not just saying that all media are bad and stay away, but bad media are bad, right? And how do you tell the difference? So having them call out ads that they know contain overt biases, and then some ads that they feel like are really powerful and provocative and educative, that they both exist in the world. This is the third kind of activity where we actually let students develop their own ad campaigns. So you've seen what the bias looks like in ads, and you've seen what the potential is, and like, how would you create your own ad campaign? And sometimes we'll let them do it, low tech. It can be drawn or photographed, but sometimes, it'll be like a public service announcement or something that you're really interested in. A lot of times we'll try to create an audience, whether it's on the school campus or in the community. But certainly in this digital world, there are probably firewall safe spaces and social media sites where young people can share these positive ads. The second area that I think about in terms of reading the media would be imaged media, whether it's film or video games. And so, we looked at sometimes look at the first 90 seconds of Aladdin and think about what we were telling kids about the Middle East in 1990, right? And so there's a new Aladdin, which brings a lot more sensibilities. It's not without its shortcomings, obviously, in terms of equity, but it's different. So critically reading and thinking about what were some of the blind spots in the 1990 film that were maybe addressed in the 2020 film, 30 years later. But we want students critically reading films and thinking about countercultural filmmaking and how social change is sometimes spurred by media, and sometimes media is reacting to social change. But the interlocutors look very different in 2019 for Star Wars versus 1977. Both iterations would be considered countercultural filmmaking, but the who that's on the screen is very different on the right than on the left. And this is just a 40-year difference. So we get students to think about, what are the blind spots? And maybe 40 years from now, in 2061, we'll look back at the 2019 film and there'll be even more blind spots that we didn't necessarily recognize. A third kind of space is really having students to become researchers of their own media use. So it doesn't have to be iTunes or Netflix. That's just a shortcut way of saying, find songs that you listen to or films that you watch, and write down the titles and a sentence or two that describes them. Choose a song. I use song here, but it could be a film, it could be a video game, it could be another media artifact to analyze more deeply. What are the themes and what are the values? And this really, it gets to students sometimes because they realize that like these aren't great values, right? So I had a student at Notre Dame and for one of her projects for my post-colonial class, she looked at the ads that were showing up in her email and she dug deeper and like, why are these ads being sent to me? What does it say about my biases and my blind spots in the media I consume? And it really was telling for her. I've had other students that are teachers do similar kinds of projects, and it really is eye-opening for the students to begin to think about what the values are that they're consuming, because we've already, affirmed that you can't consume those values without having your own values in some way shaped, right? So you are what you eat, is what they say in the nutrition world, but you are what you consume metaphorically in the media world too. There's no way around it. If you're consuming media that have misogynistic messages or racist messages, those values are going to impact you, right? So we want young people to understand that you can't consume these media without them impacting you in some really profound ways. This is another example of an activity of looking at news content. We were looking at it for how young people are portrayed in news media, but you could ask any question. These are great ways of getting young people to kind of hone in on their media analysis. One of the ways that we think about pulling this all together, you could have picture books, chapter books, you could have novels, films, you could have research reports, depending on what your discipline is, primary artifacts, right? Some major texts. This one is more kind of in the English language arts, humanities realm. But 2 through 10 don't matter what discipline you're thinking about in terms of a multimodal theme-based unit. Films, TV shows, websites, poetry, music, social media, magazines, informational text, and really thinking about students being involved in a traditional project, a digital media project, and taking some form of social action. So that could be science, social studies, math, or humanities. One last thing that I want to say in terms of these practices is really having students analyze video games. This is another kind of what's in my iTunes activity, but video games have really become ubiquitous across all groups, really. They're all playing games more. So this, what's your favorite video game? What's the storyline? What does it mean to do good in the game? Who's bad? Thinking about what some of the themes are and how is power determined who's weak, and if you could prove the game, how would you? So that leads into another set of activities, which is actually designing video games. If you try this URL that's at the bottom, since you have access to the slides, scratch.mit.edu, you'll see that it's a free website that actually teaches kids how to code and make their own video games. So I've had students who have been making video games to kind of share larger messages with the population, or just for fun too. But if you go back to this last slide, like how can I improve the games? Well, now the productive capabilities of the digital world actually allow you to make your own games, which is pretty cool. And these are just some images. You see, they're pretty sophisticated games that young people are making and playing. So Scratch is just a wonderful website. It's a wonderful resource, and it remains free. It is constantly being updated, and people, of all ages all over the world use Scratch. I'll just go quickly through the Making Connections social media, because I've already talked a lot about this and the media platforms that young people are on. You can kind of see a rise from last year. TikTok has risen a lot. WhatsApp, in addition to Instagram, and I guess Snapchat is off the grid now as TikTok has replaced Snapchat in the world of our high schoolers. Facebook's how you say hi to your grandma, right? That's how they describe Facebook. Some of the critical uses, hashtag campaigns, educating about cyberbullying, how to protect yourself. Like I said before, having students monitor and analyze their own media use. Digital media invention is kind of last frontier. And the Yes We Code, I would say, look at that. There are other projects that are out there really trying to get girls, kids of color, kids in cities, as excited about coding as some of the others who've had more access to that in the past. So I'll end with a critical media pledge. I've had a lot of young people take this. You can see, make a list of all the media you consume, like the activity I described, establish a rating system, get rid of one media artifact that you feel sends bad messages, choose younger people in your life, check in regularly, choose a media platform to learn more about its class, start a social movement, build positive media, identify and support authors and artists and musicians and filmmakers that you feel are positive, and become a public intellectual, right? So before I go to student voice, this would be another good time if there are any questions that have come up, or if things that come up through the chat.
I'm just organizing everyone's questions right now, Ernest.
Okay, so I'll go, but once you do, feel free to just jump in. But we're almost to the point with the Q&A anyways. So I'll end, with thinking about student voice. This isn't necessarily digitally focused, but I think that the voice part of culturally responsiveness is really important. So I wanted to call it out because it is about digital literacies in a culturally responsive classroom. And to me, the most responsive classrooms are classrooms that are polyvocal. So it's not just assuming that I know what a particular culture is of a student. It's asking her, right? It's creating that space for her to just be, right? So I think we need to think about polyvocality in a responsive classroom kind of as one and the same. Oops, going the wrong way. So why is classroom talk so important? all of these reasons, right? It develops community, it increases engagement, it facilitates better writing. So when Carol was talking about writing outcomes as being a huge part of the Write Center, I find that when students are able to discuss their ideas orally, at least to richer writing, when they're able to kind of connect those modalities of speaking and writing, because I find a lot of my secondary students can write whatever they can say, but sometimes when we go straight to writing, they don't populate the page with ideas in the same way as if we talk it out and then they're writing. They're talking to a small group and taking notes as the group kind of speaks back to them what they've heard, right? So the talking really improves the writing skills, but I feel like this 5 and 6 are really about civic engagement. And again, I know that Nicole Mira is coming, she's gonna talk about this a lot, but the classroom is polyvocal, develops public speaking skills, and the more students get comfortable speaking when they're nervous in a class environment, they'll be willing to do it outside the class environment, which a lot of my work, we've taken kids into the community and they've been in community centers and in the mayor's office and you know, speaking before the superintendent and the school board or parents. And so they learn how to be public speakers in those environments. And then they learn that just because you're nervous doesn't mean that you can't do well. And then finally, the listening skill, I think, is maybe one of the most evasive skills we lack in the public sphere. Speaking means listening, right? And so you think about this quote at the bottom, you know, from the University of Missouri research, the breakdown in how we spend our communicative time. 45% of that time is listening, right? So what does that mean, right? To be a good listener, what does it mean when you're not a good listener? How can we help develop that as a skill? So one of the things that I think that the polyvocal classroom does is not just about student voice, it's also about students becoming interlocutors, is a term that I use with them. That's someone who can participate in discussions as a speaker and the listener, right? So in my work, I really hone in on 4 kinds of classroom learning modalities where there's voice. One is the whole class discussion, small group discussion, formal presentation, and debate or mock trials. So I'll talk about 3 of them. The whole class discussion is probably the most common and most important because it's a teacher-led, student-centered, and the teacher is able to model all sorts of things like how to speak out loud, how to play devil's advocate, how to allow your ideas to be transformed by the classroom, how to offer a humble thesis that is revised in the collective conversation, how to ask open-ended questions, what an appropriate turn taking is, like I speak and how long do I wait and let others speak before I jump back into the conversation? What's my Socratic voice? How do I even learn how to enunciate at a volume and in a way that others can hear me in the classroom? All those are really important. We work on scripts, as you see in that second bullet point. So some of the scripts would be how you ask for more information, how you offer a competing hypothesis, right, without dismissing someone, how you just say what you're hearing, and kind of commentary without praise or critique, right? All of these are different kinds of scripts, but you can work with the students and decide what the scripts are, and the scripts can actually be placed around the classroom. It's like the small group discussion is probably the most variable in classes, where you know, you see it in some and not in others, and some classes are actually kind of set up like this particular class is right here. But I feel like the small group is really where a lot of what you do in a large group can get transferred into a student-led, student-centered space. Small groups give more opportunities for students to speak, more student agency. A lot of times when my students are in small groups, they're actually preparing something that's going to teach the class and move the class forward, where they become experts on it. So we depend on those small groups to propel the learning in the class. You know, there are opportunities for students to learn how to listen, how to create a small community without the teacher having to carry the weight on that. So they're really important. We think about what co-facilitation means, where everyone's responsible for one another, interdependency, small group voice, how to take turns. How do you kind of mute the voice that may be too dominant without putting that person down? How do you invite in voices that may be silent? It's not just a silent person. It could be like a viewpoint that's absent, right? And so you may ask a question, that we all agree, but who might disagree with us, right? How might a smart person see things differently, or should we consider what a counter argument might be, right? So you're pulling in silent viewpoints too, and that's important. So it's not just Jake or Amanda's not talking. It's a whole viewpoint, a whole continent of people, right? And that or a particular political group or a social class, or you name it, right? We're challenged in a really good community to think about how others might be impacted by our own viewpoints, to try to see our blind spots as much as possible. I don't know why I keep going backwards. The argument and formal debate. I love to have students do this, particularly secondary students, where we either have the mock trial, or we'll argue multiple sides of an issue. We'll do forensic debate, and what I want them to do is strengthen their own arguments, because when they participate this way, they really begin to see the weaknesses in their own arguments. But also helps them understand that smart, thoughtful people can see the same issue very differently, and I think that's a really important life skill. So we'll do like one class period where we'll break up into sides and have a debate, or when we can, we'll have a mock trial that might last a little bit longer than that. And then finally is the multimodal presentation, where I tell students, I've taught every age, from middle school up through graduate school, and I tell them, you're going to speak in class, you're going to speak by yourself in class, and a lot of them are nervous. I was terrified to do this as a student myself, but it was good for me that teachers made me do that, or else I probably wouldn't have seen myself becoming a teacher. They forced me to get over that shyness, but they gave me a skill set. So when I think about multimodal presentations, I don't just think about making students speak. I think about what's the skill set, what are the barriers. One of them is confidence, the other is having something you really want to say. So I've seen students who are naturally shy, but there's an issue that we're talking about, kind of like the climate change and the issues in communities. And the students are really fired up about that. So they overcome their shyness because they're talking about something that really matters to them. And so we work on that in the class, how you develop this skill set of understanding your rhetorical situation, vocal exercises, your body language and your attitude, using your body as performance. Like how do I exude confidence or inspire others, or get them to understand that something is really poignant or harmful, right? A lot of that is in how we perform through our voice and our body, and we go through that a lot. The last thing I'll talk about is a manifestation of voice is participatory action research and social action projects. We really start with these questions. If you could change the world, what's one thing you would do? If you could change your community, what's one thing you would change? The Y PAR, we call it here, stands for Youth Participatory Action Research. And it really is defined by its who, its how, and its why. The who is young people or people who are most implicated in the problem. So a lot of times, research may be done by people outside the community or older people who have, degrees and credentials. But what about young people doing research? What about people in the community doing research? The reliance on local knowledge to better understand that problem. So the how is people working together, is participatory. It's not individual. So academic research is sometimes defined by what you do, right? Who am I? Who's the first name? We have all these ways of kind of giving status to an individual for having ideas. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but it's not the only way to do research. Research can be collective participatory enterprise. It involves a lot of people who are nameless, but who are part of a larger collective. And the why is the desire to take individual collective action. It's not just knowledge for the sake of knowledge. It's actually, we're going to take some action. So if you think of, the three words here that amplify research, those are the who, the how, the why. The youth is the who, the participatory is how, and the action is the why, right? And then they all make us think differently about the research project, research process. So speaking of the process, I've identified a 10-step process that we work from. You can see each of these are kind of a verb. We identify a problem, we develop a question, down to collecting and analyzing data, creating products. We try to have traditional products, we try to have multimodal digital products. We try to think about how we can take some form of social action based on what we've done. So I'll end, with Toni Morrison, Reading the Past, Writing the Future. She says, if there's a book you want to read but hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And so I think that Carol has really inspired us with this webinar, and all of the staff of the Wright Center. This post-pandemic world is an unwritten book, really, and we must write it, right? We have a real capability here. I don't want to overstate it, but there's a real opportunity to think very differently about what it means to educate, what it means to be in the classroom, what it means to work with parents, what it means to do academic work. They haven't just been inspired by these pandemics, but I think they have been spotlighted by this moment. It's a real opportunity. So I think that the book that I want to read is about youth and community engagement and voice. It's about digital engagement. It's about community agency. It's about collective transformation of social problems, eliminating biases, gender bias, racial bias, religious bias, cleaning up the climate, right? It's about equitable access to the distribution of our resources in schools and outside of schools. So we have to write that. Those are the, some of the things that I'm concerned about, the work we do at the center, the research that I do, and I know similarly at the Wright Center. But whatever it is, my 10th grade classroom in social studies, what I want to see is students engaged and leaning in and doing projects that they'll tell their grandchildren about, right? We have to write that book. Toni Morrison gives us permission to author. We are readers of the past. We are authors of the future. Then I'll just end with this quote from Asa Hilliard. I've never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There's no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings, and the second thing you do is love them. So with that, I just want to thank you all. It's been a real privilege to be able to speak with you. And we'll go into questions now. I'll leave the slides on, Janelle, in case folks want me to go back to a particular slide. So we can jump right in.
Great, thank you so much, Ernest. If I could think of kind of two overarching ideas to sum up what I was able to gather from your talk today, it's truly the promise and the possibilities of leveraging what we learned during 2020, during the pandemic, to cultivate students' digital genius. So I get the privilege and opportunity to be in conversation with you, focusing on students' questions, and I really want to center students at this moment. And I'd like to ask you, so how do we push back against learning loss culture by tapping into the out of classroom learning that occurred during the pandemic to cultivate students' digital literacies?
Yeah, so I'll talk about that, but the answer's in the question. Right? we push back on the learning loss by cultivating this, but I think one of the things that we can do is ask questions with students about what they've learned, right? So when we come back, I think we're rebuilding our classroom community, but the students are also coming in from communities where they have experienced a lot. But some of what they've experienced has been joy, it's been connection. They've got to spend more time with grandma and grandpa, or take on projects, or all sorts of things. And so one of the ways I think that we can do that locally, like at the school level or the district level, is kind of pull in school leaders and district leaders in these conversations, and really hear from parents and students about what they've done and what they've learned. Instead of asking a question that assumes learning loss, think about the trade-offs. Obviously, there are some things that we're going to have to attend to that you can't necessarily do when you spend a year outside of class. But there's also a tremendous amount that we've learned. So some of it is the questions that we ask, and the other is the audience. So I think if leaders and those who can make decisions are the audience, but the speakers are students and their families, and we can do that. I've been more impressed with how it's been muted inside of school systems. I feel like this is something that was given, it was brought to our doorstep, but it's not something that we agree on. Once we start talking to each other, like, well, I don't believe that. Do you believe that? Like, no. But we do know there's been inequitable access, right? That it's highlighted some of the inequities. So we don't want to turn away from that. But the last thing we want is to bring kids in from tremendously poignant year and point out all their weaknesses and flaws, right? I mean, that's just a non-starter for joy or confidence. So again, I don't think that this is an internal problem. I don't think that we are on different pages about this, but I respect the spirit of the question because it is kind of thrust upon us. What are you going to do about this learning loss, right? And we need to speak collectively and say, oh, wait a second. What we've learned is how resilient children and families are. And what we need to do September to Halloween, maybe September to the winter holidays is build community, welcome young people back, right? Laud them for what they've done to kind of get themselves back in this moment, allow them to process, allow them to celebrate and mourn. Those are the things. And the digital part of it, I think we continue to leverage by calling it out, right? That the digital capacities that we've developed, I don't think hybridity is going anywhere. You know, so there will be those moments where there will be hybrid classrooms. There will be moments where, you know, unfortunately students won't be able to be with us, and it's not as though we may have a synchronous class, but there may be ways to incorporate students when they can't be in class, right? And we can leverage that. There can be ways that we might, you know, record something that can be watched on parents' own time inside the class, right? Where I could see like there'd be a Zoom or whatever, where we're inside the class, we're filming ourselves, but it's something for parents. So there's all sorts of ways, but I think we have to ask the right kinds of questions. And we have to kind of put forward the amazing work that students and families have done in the past 18 months to do the best they can of a situation none of us asked for.
Absolutely. So we have many classroom level questions coming your way. Carol Booth Olson, the Center's director, she'd like for you to talk a little bit about polyvocality, so defining it, and what does it sound like in the classroom?
Sure. So I'm going to go back to the, while I'm talking here. So what it means is a couple of things, Janelle and Carol. One, who is speaking? Right, so I think, you know, in my hour and 15-minute class, I try to talk for no more than 5 minutes in a row. You know, sometimes it's like 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning to set something up, but I expect that everyone's going to speak in a small group or large group every class. And, you know, I expect 75% of students are going to contribute in the large group discussion. So it's polyvocal in the sense that there are multiple voices. There's also polyvocal in the sense that it's multiple viewpoints, right? So in the small group, it's like pulling in silent viewpoints. So we're constantly trying to think, you know, what are our blind spots? So for intersectionality, you know, we did this activity this past spring. Everyone has their favoritism and their least favorite one. And the least favorite one is one that would probably more likely to be considered as a victimizer. You know, someone who's doing wrong. When they're wrong, it's easy to point those out. So when we take an intersectional approach, where we're likely to jump in where we feel disabused, but we're less likely to think about who are those that we might be harming or who are those that might disagree with us. So polyvocal classroom, it shouldn't just be a place where we're finishing each other's sentences. It should be a place where we're pushing each other to consider diverse viewpoints and perspectives. So sometimes it sounds like, you know, we've all seen something and someone showing a clip from YouTube with someone that completely disagrees with us, right? And in a passionate way, and we have to sit there and process and say, well, wait a second, how does this help us to think differently? I love it, like when polyvocal classrooms, when I raise my own hand to get back into the conversation, right? So I'm the teacher, I'm like, I have something I'd like to add, right? And like, okay, after those three people, right? So I don't know, Welcome Back Carter is kind of like old in the 70s, but the kid raises and I go, ooh, ooh, ooh. So sometimes that's me. I just want to get back in. Like, I just, you know, when you get a chance, you know, can you let me back into the conversation? And it's funny, I mean, I do it humorously because it means that they take ownership. Like, okay, now you can go, right? It's all of those things. It's leaned in, it's students leaned in, it's students referring to each other by name. Not what he said or she said, but they actually know each other's names. As students being really careful with each other. So a student presenting ideas, and I will script this, so I'll say, so say we're working on like final projects or something like that, and I want everyone to speak. And so I'll say, tell Janelle one thing you heard that really inspired you. Not like, what did y'all think, right? I don't ever really ask that kind of a question because I want it to be more focused in that. Or you'll read something, you're in a small group, and can everyone, tell Janelle the sentence or phrase that really resonated with them most? Or I'll say, what kind of questions or resources, and we'll break that up, I should break that up. What kinds of questions would you want answered? Or what other resources might you see that could be valuable for Janelle, right? And so I really kind of, because otherwise you'd be scared to death, right? You're gonna speak and we hate this, what are you thinking, right? You need a new project is what you need. So, and what happens is the person presenting becomes the biggest critic and everyone else is like, no, that was good. You might want to think about this. And so it changes it, right? Because I do think if there's that fear that you're just going to be excoriated, that's not inviting, right? So we do talk about that. We really work on the scripts. I don't want people tearing each other down. I think it's fine to have multiple viewpoints, but if we err on a side, it's like, we want critical conversations, but we kind of treat each other humanely with kid gloves, right? We treat each other with kindness and say, I wonder if you thought about it this way, or if we thought about it this way. Like, this is just where I'm coming from, and you offer that. And I found that it really, people are much more comfortable talking because they know it's a supportive environment. Having the large group, small group, large group works really well for me. So the large group is really short at the beginning, where I'll bring up some concepts and talk about what we did before and what people have said and where we're at, and kind of charge them in smaller groups to maybe think for a while, write, and then come together and talk. And then, we come back and, the groups kind of talk about what they talked about, and we have a larger discussion that way. That increases more polyvocality than if we just stayed large group.
Thank you for that. So in terms of classroom discussions, I now go to Jenny's question. Jenny's from Arizona, and she asks, how do you suggest teachers bring topics like the Aunt Jemima advertisement into conversation in the classroom in states like Arizona with the Senate Bill 1532?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I mean, as part of the Ninth Circuit consent decree, I've spent a lot of time, particularly with Tucson and other districts in Arizona, thinking through this. I think that the questions that we are asking at the beginning of the media section are relatively innocuous enough. And we think about the importance of being able to read the media when there's all sorts of messages, particularly corporate messages that can be harmful, and reading the media as a 21st century literacy skill. I think it's going to be fraught. It's not just Arizona. I've had these kinds of conversations with folks in Texas and some other places where the radar is going to be up. Anything that looks like anti-racism is going to be called out. It's hard to think about where cultural responsiveness ends and anti-racism begins. I don't want to try to call that apart. But I do think there are two things. One, these larger questions, and two, Jenny, I try to let young people bring in their own media artifacts as well. I might, we might not be able to start with an Aunt Jemima, but someone's going to bring something in that deals with those same issues if we're asking these sorts of questions. And, the argument I'd make with the district would be these are media kids are consuming, and part of our responsibility is to help them think through it. But if it's my idea and I bring it in and they're my images, that's harder, right? It's like the teacher's got an agenda. That's why she brought in Aunt Jemima. Unfortunately, I think that this is going to be with us, and it doesn't do any good to get ourselves muted early, right? This is not stepping back as much as it is trying to figure out how to engage people in a conversation that's student-centered, not ideologically centered. It's important. I think we can make the argument. It's important that young people read the media critically. And it's important that we have a space in our classroom for young people to bring the media that they're consuming in and for us to ask some critical questions about it. But I totally get if you say it's a non-starter for me to bring in this image at the beginning of a unit or a conversation. I think that you're right. It's not just the 1532. There are all sorts of movements underfoot to kind of pull us out as ideologues, right? And educators are going to be, and that's why I have posts and quotes in the second slide, because some of these pandemics are still going to be with us. But I appreciate the question, but I do think if we start with some of these basic questions, and maybe what we have to do in the short term is really kind of focus on the media that kids are consuming and try to ask some thoughtful questions that are at least initially less poignant, but will get us to the same place. Thank you for that. I mean, it's a hard, I fret over everything now. I don't know if I'm the only one. Like, how am I, am I gonna even be able to get to the end of a sentence with students? It's scary. It's a tough time to be an educator who cares about these things.
Absolutely, Ernest. I would like to segue to thinking about family and home spaces. I believe earlier in the talk, you had talked about how digital media consumption is different from home to home. And I'm just wondering, how might families continue to support students' critical consumption of media? And I look at this slide as a possible way to do so in the home. Do you have anything to add to that?
So, I think it's a really important point that, I think more and more documents are parent, teacher, and student facing simultaneously, right? And these are questions that we're asking in class, and maybe, there may be time. So in kind of other presentations, I'll have more on the family engagement where I talk about 10 minutes of family-centered discussion around the kid each day. And so it could be like the taking to school or coming home from school or family road trip or dinner time conversation or in the morning or the evening, and to share the kinds of questions that we're asking in class and say, these are some of the questions that you might consider, right? We want, one of our goals is not to police young people's involvement with the media, but to be more engaged with their involvement in the media and ask them questions that encourage them to be metacognitive or to think about their own involvement. So I think you're right that the digital modality, whether it's text messages, whether it's an email, whether it's some asynchronous things that you can kind of pull off, and these are a few resources. I'd love to see, parents teachers and students creating a few short videos that can be accessed asynchronously by parents. Right? I hadn't even thought of that before. Like this moment, we've been able to do this, but we haven't. But how cool would that be, right?
That'd be great. That actually segues to Carol's question. She'd love for you to share any of the projects that you've engaged students with where they're producing digital media, and she's particularly interested in how that was shared or disseminated with families in the community.
Yeah, so there's so many, right? So some of the projects that we did, I think they can go. Some of the students are actually in. So I think the last slide has students are actually in the Los Angeles City Hall. Yeah, these are all. So, but there's a particular mention. I'll do this one since I've been scrolling. This is the other side of this. Podium and screen are about 300 people. their parents and the mayor and city council reps and the news. And so the students created, this was really, you can see some of the demands about what could happen in the learning classroom. So they had demands because they've been reading Frederick Douglass, and power concedes nothing without a demand. So instead of the conclusion, they had demands at the end of their presentation. So this is the end, and you can kind of see students should be active participants in teaching and learning, some of the other things there. So this was they made a documentary, they created a policy brief, they had a longer policy paper that they shared with the superintendent. And so the superintendent shared that widely. They did professional learning sessions with teachers. At the time, our best way to get this up was YouTube. So we had a YouTube channel and a website where people could come and look at the videos, and there were tons of downloads and commentary on those videos. The students also went to professional learning conferences like the American Educational Research Association and NCTE. We had like community nights. So there were a lot of ways that we tried to disseminate the work that they were doing.
Ernest, hi, this is Carol. I'm just jumping in. Could you tell me what they wanted to change about their community? What was the focus of the, do you remember?
Sure. Yeah, so this was a project I directed for 12 years. And each year we had 4 or 5 groups. So, total like 50 plus projects, Carol. This particular one where you see what they wanted to change was really how students were regarded in schools. But some of the other projects would be looking at how the media portrayed young people, anti-bullying, climate injustice, food deserts. Just I would let them choose kind of what they wanted to do as a group. So they, and then in the, it's been like 20 years of a bunch of projects, but the things that you would imagine. One group really wanted to have fruitful and open conversations between police and students about how they could work together in the community for change. Trying to think of what some of the others are, but they kind of like those are some of them, like economic hardship and how this is we went to the state. Arnold Schwarzenegger was actually governor when we started this, so they talked to Arnold Schwarzenegger. How we could provide more economic relief for families. There was one where here in the Midwest where students wanted to convert post-industrial space into public park spaces. And so they worked with Parks and Rec and got that done. So a ton of really great projects over a quarter century.
Perfect, thank you. That's very helpful.
So we just have one concluding question for you, Ernest. The theme of this series is reimagining the post-pandemic literacy classroom the first 100 days. What should we be thinking about those first 100 days back this fall? What should teachers and school leaders be focusing on?
So 2 things. First of all, celebrating ourselves and the amazing journey that we took as educators to be here. Right. So I think that that can be understated, how hard this has been for educators. I don't have to tell you all that, but for others, right? So it's really like the human stuff, the interpersonal stuff, like bringing food to faculty meetings, right? Those sorts of things. And then I think the related would be to really celebrate and welcome back children and families, and to make sure that without overdoing it, we're processing and moving forward. It's a really fine balance. We don't want to just overemphasize this. We don't want to let it go too soon. We have to play it by ear, but it should be tremendously interpersonal and celebratory. But I feel like school leaders and teachers, we need to, like, people are exhausted. And not only just the virus stuff, all the stuff that Jenny just brought up in her question, right? So I've really been focused on that, like the people connections. We should take our time, and we should be really patient with ourselves, and not worry about how it looks or how fast we're going, because this is going to take time. It took 16 or 18 months of our lives, you know, we're at 16 months, but depending on when we go back to school, depending on like 18 months, it's going to take more than a day or two, right? So I hope we're patient with students. I hope we're patient with ourselves. I hope we are able to lift ourselves and each other up and realize that we just did something truly amazing to even keep our virtual doors open and to educate kids. But those are the things I think, Janelle, that really concern me the most is whether we are able to reform ourselves and heal ourselves as individuals and communities and reform these communities is the most important work of those first 100 days.
Thank you so much, Ernest, for reminding us to center humanity in our work in the fall. At this point, I'll invite Carol to come join us on video and offer her concluding remarks.
Okay, well, I really want to thank you, Ernest, for such inspiring and substantive remarks. I especially was moved by the idea we're readers of the past and authors of the future, that we can write the book post-pandemic, and that it really starts with focusing on students' assets and on building community. I think that's so important. And Janelle, hang on one second. Sorry, person out in the yard doing the blowing. Oh well. I want to, again, I think this was such a fabulous presentation that really gets us thinking about our classrooms and how to celebrate kids and sort of build on their strengths. We want to invite you all to come to our remaining Wednesdays. We have Elise Eidman Adal, Nancy Frey, Nicole Mira, Trisha Ibarvia, and Felisa Rose Chavez. So Ernest has sort of gotten us started thinking about this whole idea of the first 100 days, and we have much more to come. We have certificates of participation for those of you who will be with us the 6 weeks and you would really like to have something that says you attended. Those will be available on July 28th. We'd also like to tell you that in the fall, we have another learning series called Centering Students' Identities Through Responsive Reading and Writing Practices. We have Melissa Smith from the Teach Live Poets movement and Micah Bornay, a spoken word poet who's going to present. We also have Julia Torres, who will be making doing a webinar for us, and she's from the Disrupt Text movement. So we're looking forward to that. We also want you all to save the date, December 15th, 2021. We're doing a full day live virtual conference. Our keynote speakers are Cornelius Minor and Troy Hicks. And we also have Maisha Wynn, Jennifer Fletcher, Mary Howard, and a whole host of other people that you can choose from. So please save that date. Registration for that opens August 15th. Again, thank you, Ernest. What a wonderful morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. And I thank you for all of us, from all of us, for joining us, and to you who are here to make the time to be here. We look forward to seeing you on the upcoming Wednesdays. So goodbye for now, and thanks again.
Bye. Thanks, Carol. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, that's it. Any questions? Yeah, for me, or you want me to clarify? This was live, so I didn't want to like do commentary while I was speaking. All right, 3 more days and it's all over. I know this is a tough 5 weeks. Take care, be well. I'm gonna stop recording, close this so I can get this up onto the YouTube channel as quickly as possible so that others can get a chance to see this. So I hope this was helpful. Hopefully it made a lot of connections to what you're doing and reading about in Module 3. So take care, be well, and I'll see you on the emails.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Bye.